The lands of southern Morocco and the western Sahara were inhabited by nomadic Berbers. One of these groups were known as the Sanhajas. They initially were from sub-Saharan Africa, but had been displaced north by other tribes into the nearly inhospitable desert. And it was here that they lived on the very fringe of civilization, adapting, toughening, surviving for centuries. They were known for the facial coverings that they would wear, such that only their eyes would be visible, a practical step for the dust and sand of their arid climate. The people of Al-Andalus would later describe them as the Al-Mulathamun, the Veiled Ones. It was estimated that in the 8th or 9th century they had converted to Islam, but their isolation in the wilderness made them adapt and change the religion to suit their own needs. Many still held on to pagan teachings. It was sometime in the early 11th century, some sources give the year 1046, Professor Hugh Kennedy gives 1035, that an elder of the Sanhaja set forth to bring religious orthodoxy to his people. His name was Yahya ibn Ibrahim, and he journeyed across the great desert to Mecca on pilgrimage. On his return from the Hajj, he was guided by scholars in first the Tunisian city of Kairouan, and then later in southern Morocco to bring back an expert with him. The man he chose was Abdullah ibn Yasin, who was a theologian and a scholar of the Maliki legal system, which advocated a very strict Sunni orthodoxy. This man was on a mission, but perhaps he took his role a little too seriously. Professor Hugh Kennedy picks up the tale. Quote, "When Ibn Yasin arrived among the Gudala, which, by the way, is the name of the local tribe, under Yahya's protection, he began to enforce a simple and rigoristic view of Islam. He decreed that he was entitled to a third of all, quote, unclean property, that is, the possessions of all the converts, and he instituted a regime of brutal floggings, not only for adultery, slander, and drunkenness, but for minor irregularities in the performance of prayer. Not surprisingly, this made him numerous enemies in the tribe, and after the death of his protector, Yahya ibn Ibrahim, he was expelled." End quote. Now, to say this man was simply expelled was putting it lightly. The man was nearly killed. But Ibn Yasin was not one to take no for an answer. He returned to a neighboring Sanhaja tribe known as the Lamtuna, and with them he gained ground and found acceptance. And with their help, he set forth to bring order to what he perceived as being chaos. Now, like with other revolutionary movements, it didn't always go well, and Ibn Yasin found himself at times huddled for cover along with his followers in a fortress enclave known as Rabat. The Arabic, by the way, for those who are bound together in a ribat, again a fortress, is al-Murabitun, and the name implies that those who are bound together to fight for religious duty. And so, from al-Murabitun, you get the name of their movement, the Almoravids, or Almoravids. I've heard both. Take your pick. The Almoravids were the embodiment of Ibn Yasin's philosophy, strict orthodoxy, and a need to bring others into the fold forcefully if need be. Kennedy gives us some more insight. Quote, "With Ibn Yasin, Islamization and conquest went together. Like the Prophet and the early Muslim leaders on whom he modeled himself, he sought to unite the tribes to conquer the outside world and to replace the tribal leadership with a religious one. Once he had secured his position among the Lamtuna, he immediately launched military expeditions, just as the Prophet had done." End quote. Chris Lowney, in his book A Vanished World, also puts this all together very nicely. Quote, "The Almoravids, again also Almoravids, succeeded through a volatile mix of militancy, asceticism, and unwavering religious zeal. Their name itself attested to their vision and tenacity. Almoravid, Al-Murabatun, the ones bound to religious duty, huddled within their ribats guarding Islam's North African desert frontiers, the Almoravids wed strict religious observance to military struggle." End quote. It was by 1053 that Ibn Yasin was able to bring the local tribes together and unite them under his banner. It wasn't always a peaceful endeavor. Some of them got slaughtered along the way. But now he had an army and was ready to expand. I've already described how unforgiving the land was. The Almoravids were pragmatic and formidable because, well, they had to be in these harsh surroundings. But the land did have one incredible attribute. The trade routes passed right through here. The northern hub of this route was located in the city of Sijil Massa, in current-day Morocco, which the Almoravids took in 1054. And the southern hub of this route was located in the city of Autagast, in current-day Mauritania, which they managed to take in 1055. Now, owning the caravan trade is one thing, but these trade routes were famous because they led to the gold-rich lands of Ghana and Mali, which is where most of Al-Andalus got its bling. The Almoravids suddenly found themselves with the means to field more men and bigger armies and take on new regions. They were becoming an empire. Things went on like this for the next couple of years, but in 1059, while attempting to bring the Berbers of northern Morocco into the fold, Abdullah ibn Yassin was killed. He was succeeded by one of his generals and co-commanders, a man by the name of Abu Bakr ibn Umar, who was a member of the Lamtuna tribe and was very instrumental in the Almoravid expansion. But Abu Bakr was a warrior to his core. The empire that he helped create now needed administration and bureaucracy. It had grown just that big, things that he just couldn't stand. So Abu Bakr decided to outsource his problem by placing his cousin, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, who was renowned as being shrewd and intelligent and much better at politics and organization, in charge of the developing government structure. And then he went off to do what he loved best, putting down revolts and being a field commander, leading men into battle, fighting. If this strikes you as being one of those poor decisions in history or just downright stupid in general, well, it's because it was. When Abu Bakr got back from one of his missions, he discovered that Yusuf ibn Tashfin had basically taken over, at which point Abu Bakr simply had to acquiesce to it, and then he went off to fight on some other front. Yusuf ibn Tashfin was going to be the man to really bring the Almoravids into that realm of being a major player. It was said by some sources that in 1062, other sources say 1070, that he founded the city of Marrakesh. It was going to be his administrational capital, and once it was founded and the bureaucracy was in place, the expansion really took off. To the east, the border was extended into the Maghreb all the way to the city of Algiers. Some historians say that in 1076 the southern border was expanded past the Sub-Sahara to take over the Empire of Ghana. More than likely, however, this was simply a major raid. Now, just as a side note, it was possible that due to this raid, Ghana was destabilized enough to allow for the rise of other empires like that of the Empire of Mali. To the north, the Almoravids reached the Strait of Gibraltar. By 1079, Tangier was occupied, and by 1083, despite holding out for a while, the port of Ceuta was taken as well. Yusuf ibn Tashfin now commanded a vast portion of Western Africa, and it was at this point in the year 1086 that he got a distress call from his fellow Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula who were just a short distance away. Now, from the message that he got, the fractured pieces of the Caliphate, the Taifas states, were in a right bloody mess. Their backs were up against the proverbial ropes, the Christian kingdoms in the north were coming after them, and they were desperate for help. By this point, the Almoravids had fashioned themselves as the saviors of the Islamic world through their strict doctrine, and were perhaps convinced of their righteousness by their rapid growth. It is, after all, hard to argue with success. So how could they possibly say no to their Taifa neighbors? So what were the Taifas like? Let's do a thought experiment, and this is probably more applicable to my audience in the United States, but, just for the sake of argument, imagine one day waking up and becoming aware of the fact that the Great Union is no more. The states have broken down along their borders, and then there's a wild free-for-all for supremacy. And for, again, the sake of argument, I could imagine the armies, the combined armies of Los Angeles and San Francisco moving north to conquer Portland and Seattle. Granted, there's a bit of personal bias there. The western states would form a hardy coalition for a hardy people. Texas. Well, Texas would become her own empire, and no one would ever tell her what to do again, because after all, you don't mess with Texas. The Midwest would be firmly ruled by its capital in Chicago, and in a rare move of stunning brilliance, Rhode Island would blitzkrieg and subjugate all of her neighbors, rendering New York City a vassal. And this all within one generation. Sounds crazy, right? But that was exactly what was going on in Al-Andalus. The mighty caliphate that was established under Abd al-Rahman III and expanded militarily by al-Mansur was declared gone in 1031, brought down by massive insurrection and civil war. She had thus fractured into a multitude of smaller states. It was estimated to be about 30 of them in all. Some encompassed a fairly decent chunk of land, and others were no bigger than a castle in the immediate surroundings. Now, while the former capital, Córdoba, lost prominence, many other cities rose in significance. Toledo, Granada, Valencia, Zaragoza became the leading contenders, of which Seville became the most aggressive. And I'll spare you the details of the blow-by-blow action, but Kennedy puts it very succinctly. Quote, "The politics of the Taifa kingdoms were driven not by ethnic rivalries, but by a desire, even the need of powerful kingdoms to take over their neighbors and so capture more resources. Until the middle of the 11th century, most of the states which had been established after the year 1010 maintained their separate identities. Thereafter, there was a spate of takeovers and mergers, which meant that by the year 1085, there was a smaller number of bigger players." End quote. It almost sounds like something you could make a really cool video game out of. These states rivaled with one another for military dominance, but paradoxically enough, their level of sophistication, despite this turmoil, did not diminish. In fact, quite the opposite. It advanced. Much like the city-states of Renaissance Italy, they would vie also for economic and cultural dominance as well, luring in the best artists and craftsmen. And if you're looking for a testament to this, you'd have to look no further than the stunning Mudahar style of architecture, the libraries of Toledo, the Alhafira Palace in Zaragoza, or the Alcazar in Seville. Look this last one up online, by the way. There's a reason why Game of Thrones was filmed here. But here's the thing, the overall strategic situation was now vastly different. During the time of the late Caliphate, al-Mansur would lead powerful raids into the Christian north, brutalizing anyone that stood in his way. In 997, he even razed the pilgrimage city of Santiago de Compostela to the ground. Now the emerging Christian kingdoms would return the favor as they soon had the ability to raid the south at will. In fact, the warrior king of Castile-Leon, Ferdinand I, in the late 1050s would essentially blitz the entire peninsula. Eventually, these northern Christian kingdoms would find a better means to capitalize on the weakness of the Taifas. This new system was based on tribute, known as parillas. Chris Lowney describes them. Quote, "While Muslim Spain was fraying, Christian Spain was coalescing. Christian kingdoms, long accustomed to forking over humiliating tribute payments to buy off the threat of Muslim invasion, now turned the tables. Christian princes extorted annual levies from their Muslim brethren, a practice that would continue off and on for centuries. Reconquest rhetoric may have portrayed Christian Spain's monarchs as undyingly committed to clawing back the peninsula for Christendom, but they frequently found it better business to leave economically vibrant Muslim mini-states intact and rake in the tribute." End quote. Now keep in mind one thing, these parillas were brutal, and as long as the Taifas were forking over most of their budget, they couldn't raise any major armies, but instead they had to raise taxes, and thus became extremely unpopular with their own people. And so it went on like this for a while. And then Alfonso VI took center stage and changed everything. The Kingdom of Castile-Leon, due to her long border, took the brunt of the Moorish onslaught. She had thus adapted into a resilient and powerful military state, hence her warlike insignia, and in time would lead the charge against the Muslim Taifas. After the fall of the Caliphate, her long border was now an asset, as she now had multiple smaller neighbors who were ripe for extortion and for coughing up tribute. In 1065, the king, Ferdinand I, after a successful military career, died. He made the schmuck decision of dividing up his kingdom amongst his 3 belligerent sons, and thus firmly committed them all to civil war. His youngest and perhaps not brightest son, Garcia, got the area known as Galicia. Sancho, the firstborn, got Castile, and Alfonso VI, his favorite, got Leon. To make a long and confusing story short, Sancho and Alfonso, like older siblings sometimes have a tendency to do, ganged up on the youngest. They got together and seized Garcia's land and banished him, and then, after a 3-year hiatus from fighting, Sancho turned on Alfonso and expelled him from his land, exiling Alfonso to the Taifa of Toledo, which I kind of covered in the previous podcast. Now, Sancho didn't live for very long. He was assassinated in 1072, and a lot of people think that Alfonso had a hand in this, despite his later extensive reassurances that he was totally innocent. This reminds me of Cicero, by the way. He had a legal argument of finding out who was really guilty when there was a shred of doubt. He asked the question, cui bono, which means, who benefits? So speaking of benefits, Alfonso VI now gained the entire kingdom of Castile and Leon. He built up a vast army and got insanely wealthy off a Moorish tribute. He spent the next couple of years building up his military and consolidating his hold on his kingdom. Now, you can't exactly fault the guy for being a little paranoid. He did, after all, get double-crossed by his brother while he was double-crossing his other brother. And after all, the man was now in power, and he wanted to make it a point to stay in power. And so Castile became a formidable powerhouse. Over a decade later, the ruler of Toledo, the same place that Alfonso once had to take refuge in, was no longer able to stay in control. His life was threatened by his own people, and to make matters worse, the city had come under intense pressure from rival Seville. The ruler was looking to make a deal to get out of his predicament. Thus, in exchange for safe passage to Valencia, Alfonso VI was basically handed the keys to the city. But to save face, the Castilian king had to at least pretend to lay siege to it, which he did, and then after a bloodless show of force, Alfonso VI, quote-unquote, conquered Toledo in 1085. It would forevermore be in Christian hands. The fall of a major taifa sent shockwaves through the rest of Al-Andalus. They realized not only what a precarious position that they were in, but also just how powerful Castile had gotten. When Alfonso continued the offensive and moved on to lay siege to Zaragoza just later that year, they had had enough. The Taifa rulers, realizing that they could potentially be wiped out altogether, began to take stock of what they had. Beautiful gardens? Check. Fancy palaces? Check. Nice clothing? Check. A military force that could oppose the Christians? Oh, yeah, that'd be a big no. All those years of paying parillas, those massive tributes, left little for the defense budget. And even if they did combine their militaries, they lacked the political cohesiveness that would have been needed. So, to put it bluntly, they needed help, and the Almoravids were so close by. Now, despite the fact that both the Andalusi, that is, the people of Al-Andalus, and the Almoravids were both Muslim, they both came from two completely different worlds. These two groups made very strange bedfellows, so let's just put this out there. The Taifas did not like the Almoravids, who they regarded as backwater, primitive, uncouth, fanatical religious zealots. And the Almoravids likewise thought of the Andalusi as decadent, arrogant, morally weak, liberal drunkards, and they didn't care much for their cohabitation within the Taifas with the Jews and the Christians. But Al-Andalus had no choice, and after serious debate, they invited the Almoravids in. The Almoravids came in the year 1086. Per a stipulation of their agreement with the Taifa leaders, the port city of Algeciras was given to them to enter. Imagine the scene in your head. It's July 1086, and the ships from North Africa have appeared in the harbor. With a purpose, 500 elite troops of the vanguard begin to march off the vessels. They are battle-hardened veterans of the tribes of the Sun Haja. They carry weapons and armor that have seen action on several fronts and in numerous battles. They are infused with a religious zeal to fight to the death if need be. And as they embark, their heads are covered such that only their eyes can be seen. The Al-Mulathamun, the Veiled Ones, have arrived. They secure the port, and a few months later in September, their leader, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, arrives with an estimated 12,000 more of them.